It is Friday, September 19th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Skate episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PS Plus reminder. Not only is the Essential lineup still live on PSN for September, but we also have Extra and Premium now live as well, and that also means we now have some games that will exit the game catalog in about a month's time, which this time around, only 4 games leaving. That is Battlefield 1, Ghostbusters Spirit Unleashed, Tour de France 2023, and then for Premium, The Last Clockwinder for PlayStation VR 2. Which, with that PSVR 2 game leaving, that means there's only, I think, 3 or 4 PSVR 2 only games on Premium as a benefit. The other 2-3 games on there are optional PSVR 2 modes, so that one is really dwindling, but it's actually kind of ironic how we had so few games going in this month, but we don't have a mass exodus this time around. Only 4 games are going out. So in a weird way, it actually is still a net positive for the amount of games that are still available in PlayStation Plus for this month. Anyway, moving on to our first news story, we have a new PS5 system software update now live on PSN, this one being version 25.06, 12.00, and this one has only 2 main changes as we saw from the beta phase. That is, DualSense and DualSense Edge controllers can now register multiple devices, so very handy there. We pretty much put out a pseudo tutorial on Wednesday to show you how to do that. It's really not hard, and it's very handy now to be able to, sort of hot swap between devices, which it does indeed work as advertised, so you can check that out. And then the other one is the new power save mode, which it's on, but it's not on because no games officially support it just yet. Over on the PlayStation blog, Sony did confirm that the first 3 games that will support this with future software updates for these games is Death Stranding 2, Demon's Souls, and Ghost of Yōtei. Perhaps Yōtei will probably be the first one to have an update go live, since I would imagine the patch for that did not get sent with the Gold Master, so maybe by the time the game does come out, we'll be able to at least test that game out and see if it does cut the wattage right down the middle, because that was the rumor we're trying to track here, is that, oh, this power save mode, cool. It obviously helps with Sony's commitment and mission to lower their carbon footprint and be net zero by 2040, 2050, somewhere around there. But realistically, nobody's going to want to use this for the console. So it's probably future-proofing the local play handheld with the software coming out in the here and now. And so the rumor does state that a lot of these games will be cut down in half for their wattage, and you'll see a scale back in performance, resolution, frame rate, things like that. So we will definitely be watching that very closely and test these games out once they finally go live. Now, there is one other software update that we cannot forget, and that is our lovely legacy PlayStation 4 system. Version 13.0 is now live on PSN as well, and this one has basically nothing outside of improving the messages and usability on some screens, which I imagine there is probably something in there behind the scenes that does help PS4 ever so slightly, but unsurprisingly, it's not really getting any major updates nowadays. But PS4 did get a somewhat mandatory 13.0 update, and that's all it does. Anyway, moving on, the new PlayStation 5 model that we heard about from 2 weeks ago, CFI 21 or 2200 series, that is now available and showing up in Europe, so you can order it from various retailers. I don't think anybody has done a teardown of this console just yet, but as a reminder, it's the digital edition console. This one is CFI 2216, and it has 825 gigabytes of SSD storage, so it was downsized there. But this new model, this new chassis design is out there in the wild. I would imagine the teardown will show perhaps some internal changes, some things moved around, so Sony can make the console a little bit lighter to ship and try to protect their margins. Next up, the rumored PlayStation State of Play or PlayStation Showcase, but probably a State of Play, is in all likelihood probably happening sometime next week based on a number of factors. Like, for example, nothing happened this week, so before TGS kicking off next week, Sony probably wants to announce it on Monday or Tuesday, have the live stream the following day. They've done live streams every September for the past 6 years now during the PlayStation 5 cycle primarily. We keep hearing it's late September. We had Nate the Hate chime in on Twitter. Somebody asked, is it this week or next week? They think next week. So it is probably happening sometime next week. And that is where we'll finally have Sony do probably a 30-plus minute, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a 40-plus minute live stream, a lot of third-party announcements, Yakuza Kiwami, for example, just got leaked, or Yakuza Kiwami 3, so it's like that was probably going to be in the state of play, and you're probably over this weekend going to hear a number of like leak lists come out or something that may or may not be entirely accurate, but there's that. And with first-party stuff, I mean, obviously we are expecting, I would hope we finally get that Saros gameplay. I cannot wait to see more of that game. Potentially the 2.5D Metroidvania God of War game. Maybe Horizon Online, the multiplayer game, but that's in all likelihood probably not happening. We're hearing nothing about that game just yet. And of course, Marvel's Wolverine as well, which that is a good segue into our next story, because while we had a very strong rumor initially about how the game is going to have a proper re-reveal, a new trailer is completed for this presentation, we are also hearing from MP First that the game is still on track for 2026. According to a source familiar with the situation, the game is still right on time. And we say that because while Insomniac has never put a release year on this game, we did see that from the Insomniac breach, is that based on their own development timeline, they were shooting for 2026. Now, as far as the exact release timing, a release window, a certain quarter, that we do not know. I would imagine it's probably around September, October, somewhere around there. So we're still going to be doing a decent amount of waiting, because we know it's not within this fiscal year. So that would be at least past April going into 2026. But, you know, that's at least my shot in the dark there. We can also mention in the same report, though, from MP First, we did get an update for Marvel's Venom as well, which this too is a project that we learned about from the Insomniac breach. This game has never been properly confirmed or announced, but this has always been the problem surrounding the Insomniac breach, is that while that did happen in 2023, plans do change, and they can change very rapidly. But anyway, we do have this report from MP First where they do say Venom has been in active development. They also got some story details that they could not verify, and I would assume that means check with another source. So they do recommend taking this with a grain of salt, but we are hearing apparently this game would focus on Eddie Brock, and visually this would be very close to his comic book version instead of the live action one from Tom Hardy. And the game will also feature Cletus Cassidy as Carnage, which that was leaked from the Insomniac breach already. But MP First also came across some evidence that Insomniac is working to include Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, into one of their projects, but it's unclear on what game. Probably Spider-Man 3, I would imagine, but that's all speculation. But that's the thing about the Insomniac breach, is that it kind of, in a way, complicated the conversation surrounding the studio's timeline in a way that we don't normally have, because like, it was fascinating to have all that material, sure, but we've seen examples of, like, even from the breach, like, oh, well, the Great Web, the multiplayer live service Spider-Man game that was going to be a thing, canceled. We were never supposed to learn about that game. So you know what I mean? Like, we might have job listings that clue us in on, oh, they're working on a multiplayer project. And that was the case during that time. So it's like, oh, that was the Great Web. But we can't say with certainty, like, oh, that's what this thing is going to be until you get an announcement or a breach. You know what I mean? Like, so it's tough to say with confidence that, like, oh, these things are definitely happening when, like, even if we heard about it, you can't say for certain that it's still a thing. And that was, like, the problem with Venom, is that I was always very careful to say, like, oh, well, that game's coming. Well, we don't know that. Like, it could get canceled just like we saw with the Great Web or the 3 DLCs for Spider-Man 2. Having said that, we now have a rumor suggesting it is still in development, and based on the timeline, that would suggest, and this has been brought up in the article, but it's like, okay, if we're looking at Marvel's Wolverine sometime next year, you know, this game, Venom, rather, could be very analogous to Miles Morales and what that game was for PS5 in 2020, which is a launch title and also a cross-gen title. So Venom could be propped up as that same thing of a smaller mediary title for PlayStation 6, 2027, late 27. It'll still launch on PlayStation 5, and then you'd have Spider-Man 3, the next big mainline entry in 2030, 31, whenever that ends up happening. So that's kind of like the rough timeline, and I guess we are a little bit more informed because of that breach. But, things do change very rapidly internally at a studio, and more so when you consider the context of what happened to Insomniac, right? Because we even, based on the timing, had emails about, the impending layoffs, and that moves people around. That moves projects around dramatically. So it was also not great timing to have that breach when, again, it's hard to say with confidence, oh, these things are happening because we saw it. Well, that's not always the case, but we are hearing that Venom is still alive. Let's move on to Sony's 2025 corporate report, which is just a very long document going over the current state of affairs in the Sony group. So things like their fifth mid-range plan, different segments being broken down, what initiatives are they focusing on now, certain goals they want to achieve, a lot of things like that. And so for the games and network services segment, Sony showed off this revenue composition circle for fiscal year 2024, which was last year. And so you can see the revenue percentage for network services, add-on content, hardware, it all seems about right. But the news story here is physical software. It's a mere 3%. So, oh my God, what's going on? Ring the alarm bells. But if you haven't heard, this number is definitely a bit misleading because it's how Sony counts revenue. That's why it's 3%. That 3% is for first-party games only because they recognize the full revenue at the point of sale. Third parties, they collect royalties, right? So that's different from PSN, where it's Sony's own store. They recognize revenue on everything, and then they distribute 70% earnings to third parties. That's how that works. So the actual metric is closer to like 25%. And then as a reminder, like the way that you can always frame these in a more positive light is that last year Sony sold 70 plus million physical video games across first and third party. Like that's a lot. Now, again, like 25% is still low. We know that like in the US, for example, physical games are at an all-time low. It's like less than $2 billion a year, and that's pretty small comparatively to everything else. But it's always about how you frame those numbers. Like the other misleading one is always the ratio split that Sony shows off during their quarterly reports. And it's like, sure, it's 70, 80 something percent sometimes, but that includes every full a la carte game sold on PSN, which is 12,000 something games versus the very limited space that games have in a retail setting or even limited print companies, which that inherently is limited print. You know what I mean? So it's always about how you frame it, but it's just to sort of demystify that metric if you heard about it. And the good news is we have some very strong rumors that PlayStation 6 will still accept disc playback, which I'm quite happy about. Now, a few other things we can mention on the same document is Sony's commitment to single-player games, which, for some, they need to hear this because they think Sony is going away from this segment of video games, but that's not true. It's still here in this 2025 report, where under the initiatives that each business is trying to pursue, it does say, and I quote here, strategic investments that leverages our active users and high level of user engagement, and also expansion of our user base through highly narrative-driven single-player video games and live service video games. So live service is still there, right next to single player, but it was listed there, and then one other part of the document, same thing, focusing on engaging, rich single player experiences. They never walked away from this stuff. What's more telling is that they're spending a lot of time in the past three-ish years, I want to say, of really focusing on user engagement. This is the new metric that they're hyper concerned with in this climate of, a new generation of people coming into video games, and they're spending a lot of their screen time on not PlayStation, and not even so much a PlayStation thing, but they're spending screen time on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. I mean, no matter what, it's just something where the time is going somewhere, and they would prefer you to play your gameplay hours on PlayStation, your screen time on PlayStation, because that also means you're probably bringing your money over as well. So that is what they're still really focused on. But this does go into our next story, which is one part of the document that is missing on this year versus the one from the previous year is beyond console revenue and that initiative. And so people are looking at this wondering what's going on because under strategically emphasized indicators, it used to say game revenue beyond console. So for 2025, it's not on there anymore. So it was pointed out that, hey, look at PlayStation's recent financial report. Non-PlayStation platforms accounted for only 2% of their sales in Q1 fiscal year 2025. The sales of first-party games, I should say, on non-PlayStation systems. They do point that out in their supplemental info forms. Now, there are a few things to remember here, which is that's out of the entire PlayStation business. So it's not really 2%, and this might not sound that much more flattering, but it's closer to like 5%. But there is that to consider. And so there's that. But also, as we just mentioned, it's based on how Sony recognizes revenue, right? So with a first-party game, they recognize full revenue on PlayStation 5 versus 30% on other stores, because at that point, they're a publisher on a different storefront. So they're not collecting full revenue on these other stores. Then there's also the fact that like Sony is still, in the grand scheme of things, like on a studio per studio basis, title by title basis, everything has its own P&L statement, right? So this is still very important on a title-by-title basis of when they eventually ship these games over to PC, maybe do some experimenting on Switch 2 or any other agreements that they might have. Maybe if they go off and do another Helldivers 2, so another live service game on Xbox, for example, and we expect live service games will at least day and date ship PS5 and PC. But, we saw from the most recent quarter that live service titles like MLB, Destiny, and Helldivers 2 were accounting for upwards of 30-40% on that balance sheet for first-party games. So it's like, it's always about how you frame the numbers. You can make it sound really bad, and then that would make you think like, oh, is Sony going to go back on this multi-platform approach, do strictly exclusivity on only PlayStation consoles because it's only accounting for a very small portion of revenue for the entire business? It's doing basically nothing. Or is it something where you can frame it as, well, on the P&L statement for each individual game, when it does $500,000 on PC, maybe $1 million, $2 million, and that might be less than the PlayStation 5 version, but that still helps that game be a lot more profitable, and that funds the studio's next game or something that keeps them afloat. It's always about how you approach it. I'm inclined to say that, why was it missing on this year's corporate report? Probably because it's already ingrained in the business model already, because they're pretty mature into this initiative already, which is the back catalog has been shipped on PC. And I say that as in like, some of the more recent PS4, late PS4 stuff, and then most of the PlayStation 5 cycle. Don't get me wrong, there's some games in there that are missing, but when we're talking about the sort of games that have a lot of upside shipping on PC, and then you're seeing the live service stuff as well, you're seeing some experimentation with Switch games, for example, like it's already kind of like, it's in the business. So I would think that's why it's not on here as an initiative. There's like many other aspects of the PlayStation business that is not outlined in this report, because these are things they're already doing. So that's at least that's my read on the thing. I wouldn't think too much of this. I would still fully expect that you're going to see day-and-date live service and single-player PC releases after, a year or two from launch on PlayStation consoles. Let's move on to some PlayStation Studio news, beginning with this very fresh rumor for the next mainline God of War, where recently on the Insider Gaming Weekly podcast, Tom Henderson was briefly mentioning what he had heard about this game, and that he thinks the next mainline God of War, Kratos has a curved Egyptian sword, and that's really all he says, which that would be like a Khopesh, so similar to Assassin's Creed, for example. That would be the weapon, the sort of highlight weapon he has in that game, and that's how he's phrasing it. But I mean, that sort of implies that the next mainline entry is going into the Egyptian pantheon, which does track at least with what Santa Monica has historically researched before when they were thinking about doing Norse, maybe Egypt. Well, maybe now it's time to go to Egypt, and that was also the sort of thought process for why they wrapped up the Norse games in just simply 2 entries, and that they don't want to spend 10 plus years working on just wrapping up the Norse series, so now they can move on to something else, and so that something else might just be Egypt, which, hey, I'm all for it. Mainline God of War, let's go. Kratos makes sense. It's just, at that point, pure speculation on how he gets to that pantheon. Could be something where Atreus is very clearly, at least in my view, tied into him getting there in some way, shape, or form, and then Kratos has to, go along with him or something. But I think that game's probably very far away, obviously, given that the first game we'll be seeing from Santa Monica is going to be the Cory Barlog, not a new IP, but feels like one entry, and then, we'll have this next God of War probably much further out than that. Next up, Ghost of Yōtei has 3 new trailers ahead of its launch coming up very soon, October 2nd. So this time around, we have the sort of traditional cinematic trailer that comes out like way later into the game, eventually releasing. Like, some publishers, that's the first thing they show is a cinematic trailer, and that's like, it doesn't really tell you a whole lot, which Sony has done this for some games, but typically they do show something of substance initially. it's been a trend where you get a cinematic trailer later for some PS Studio games, and so Yōtei now has that. But there's that alongside the 1000 Blades trailer, which is just a mix of story and combat. And then we also have the dual katana gameplay as well, which is Atsu wielding 2 katanas and just slicing and dicing her way through another settlement, which looks cool, looks fun. Similar to what I said before, we've seen a lot of this game, so I'm kind of good. It's not too far away at this point, and we do have the review embargo lifting very soon as well, so we'll get an idea of critical reception within the next, week, I guess, basically, because there's that. Actually, the review embargo is lifting for that, and also Silent Hill F. We just got reviews for Sonic Crossworld, so there's a lot, going on right now with what is going to be a very chaotic season. Moving on to an update for Sony's lawsuit against Tencent over their very Horizon-looking Light of Mataram game, where Sony is alleging that Tencent is infringing on Sony's copyright. And so Tencent is actually fighting it, or at least they're trying to get the whole thing dismissed. But they did provide a very lengthy response, and they are firing on every cylinder and fighting Sony's claims. So again, they're looking to get this dismissed, and they called Sony's suit an overreach. They were arguing that Sony isn't trying to protect any unique work, and they're trying to monopolize storytelling conventions that other games have used. They directly state that Sony is trying to lock down the concepts in Horizon, so things like, and they name these, but red-headed protagonists, ruined civilizations, and also mechanical enemies. They were citing other games like Legend of Zelda, Far Cry, Outer Wilds, Biomutant, all these other games that may feature some or all of these items. And they also point out that historically, Guerrilla was aware of how similar their game was to Enslaved Odyssey to the West, which that game came out in 2010. They say, quote here, "At bottom, Sony's efforts is not aimed at fighting off piracy, plagiarism, or any genuine threat to intellectual property. It is an improper attempt to fence off a well-trodden corner of popular culture and declare it Sony's exclusive domain." Now, they are also going for the technicality approach as well, because they're claiming that Sony is suing Tencent America, and that's not who's publishing or developing the game at all. So they are also looking for an approach or some kind of out here that gets them away from the whole thing in that area too. But crazy stuff. I mean, I thought they'll just be compliant and something will get figured out before this ever goes to trial or something. But no, Tencent is looking to fight it in some way. I mean, it still may not go to trial, even though they're looking for a motion to dismiss. They still, at any point, as far as I understand it, come to some sort of agreement and settle, at any point, right? So there's always that distinct possibility. But it is fascinating to see this go down the way that it is. Are they making some good points? I would say so. At the same time, other points are probably in bad faith, and I think many of them are, but that's kind of what happens when you're being accused of copying someone's homework. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm obviously not a lawyer. I am no expert in this area, so I'm not even going to humor the idea of I know for sure what's going to happen. I would just think Sony would not file this thing unless they were very confident in the case that they have and a few smoking guns that they were able to include in their initial suit as well. So we'll keep following this and see what happens with every subsequent update, but it will be crazy work if this does actually go to trial, and they do have to make their case, and they both have to see what ends up going down in the courtroom, but that's for the court system to decide. Moving on to some third-party news, the Final Fantasy VII Remake series is finally jumping ship from PlayStation, completely confirmed from Square. This was in light of 7 Remake Integrated, now being confirmed for Series S, X, Switch 2, and PC on January 22nd, 2026. They also outright confirmed that the Remake series will make its way to all platforms. So a big deal there, obviously, because we had 7 Remake come out on PS4 in 2020, and at the time we did have fine print details on, that was a 1-year exclusive agreement, console first, and it's been all these years later, and it's been locked down primarily to PlayStation. So Sony very clearly amended their original agreement. We never knew the conditions of what agreement they did sign with Square, if it was always a game-by-game basis. Did they lock down the entire Remake series as a 1-year thing, and it was always contingent on being able to change or amend certain things as the games are coming out over time or something? We just don't know. But what we do know is that Square is at least allowed to say that, yes, it's now all finally coming over, because it also implies the third entry as well. I would still think the third entry probably will be exclusive to PlayStation for a year minimum, but maybe not. Maybe that part was amended, or maybe that third game was never actually locked down. We don't know the conditions of that agreement, but at least for now, Square can say that the whole thing is coming over, so you've got more options outside of PlayStation. Which also 7 Remake Integrate is getting some quality of life features, or like they're basically cheats, so you can have like maximum HP and MP, always deal 9999 damage to enemies, or you can have like the max number of items. I guess that's coming to the other platforms, but not PlayStation. I would think that's probably just going to be a day and date patch or something when those games launch on the other systems, because Square is usually pretty good about making those things, or making all that stuff like parity-wise over time, although it's Square, so you never know. They can always be really weird and goofy with these things too, but that is at least one thing we can say for the upcoming entry. Moving on to Borderlands 4, which the game has been out for a little bit now, and the reviews were pretty good. People are enjoying their time with the game. When the game works, that's the problem, and that's the news, and more so on PlayStation 5 Pro. Yet again, another example of Sony's high-performance console actually offering a not-so-good experience compared to the base version. Although, holistically speaking, it seems like a lot of people on every platform are having troubles with this game in some way, but at least for PS5 Pro and this game, it does appear to be suffering from a memory leak issue. And so on PS5 Pro, the game is running into problems with like crazy fluctuations in frame rate. So people have noticed that if you close out of the game and relaunch it, that does fix the issue. And it even got to the point where Gearbox's Randy Pitchford is acknowledging that issue and recommending that fix as well. So, I mean, the team is probably full steam ahead on trying to optimize and improve the game and do some bug fixing and things like that. But it's the same story over and over again, which is high-profile game comes out, issues on platforms X, Y, and Z, which normally relate to performance problems or major bugs that were not addressed right away. So they were probably working with a very strict and tight deadline to get the game out on time. And so now they're sort of dealing with the aftermath. And in some cases, that will look really bad on platform holders, where PlayStation 5 Pro should be the better console if you're playing on PlayStation. And sure enough, you're running into a problem there. So, well, this whole thing is kind of funny because Randy has been kind of going off on a tirade lately with sending off emails and complaining about premium gamers and how you need a more capable PC system. But it's like, no, I mean, the game is very demanding, and even demanding systems are running into these problems. So it's a whole mess of things going on with Borderlands. And yet again, Randy Pitchford, the guy is a fascinating case study, and what you apparently can get away with when maybe you shouldn't be getting away with certain language online. But either way, it's been a whole thing. I guess you have to give it some time, and maybe they'll address this problem sooner rather than later. But, if you're PlayStation, if you're Sony, you got to be really annoyed with this example after example of your Pro console getting the worst version. Next up, we have a rumor here for another Xbox Game Studios title that is going to make its way over to PlayStation platforms, and this time around it is Microsoft Flight Simulator, where this was reported by PPE.pl, where the announcement is soon and the release is actually scheduled for November, very soon. So the game is going to be announced and shipped within 1.5 months basically. It's really not that far away from what we're hearing, but if you recall, this was one of the first games that we were hearing was going to come over to PlayStation 5. That was after the initial 4 games that were confirmed in that sort of roundtable discussion. And surprisingly, it's actually one of the, I don't want to say last, because there's still actually a lot of games from Xbox Game Studios that we haven't seen just yet. But it's like one of the back half ones, basically, that has not come over just yet. I will say Flight Simulator is a technically beautiful, gorgeous game that leverages a lot of real-time data and satellite imagery. It's a real looker. It is a flight simulator, and it's like a pound-for-pound flight simulator. It's not necessarily fun in the traditional video gamey way, but it is really cool to play around with. And if you're into aviation, then hey, that is one hell of a way to do it. and it will be cool to finally have it come out on PlayStation 5, apparently this November. Moving on to a very interesting story about Hollow Knight Silksong and the knock-on effect that the game's launch had on other teams, other games that came out around it or they were trying to come out, because that's the thing, is that they basically shadow dropped this game. It was a 2-week window, but for some teams that's just logistically very hard to move around. And so for a lot of smaller teams, they did move out of the way, but for Hell Is Us, they chose not to. And they also explained on the Friends Per Second podcast, the creative director on the game, they talk about how they had to weigh their options and they still chose to launch on the same day. But they were asked if Hollow Knight Silksong had impacted the sales of their game. And they did say that, since the game is basically the GTA 6 of indies, it was a little callous to shadow drop it like that. And for full context, they said that Team Cherry is allowed to do that. There's no rules against doing that, and they didn't have any sort of specific numbers to share, but they do say it for sure impacted the sales of their game, which is definitely a polarizing comment to make, because it's not Team Cherry's responsibility to look out for other teams and their bottom line, because they're implying that it was very careless of them to shadow drop it like that, in light of what might be not considering what that's doing to your colleagues or your peers in the space. But again, it's not really their responsibility to do that, and they're looking like the heroes in this case, because they released a highly anticipated game seemingly out of nowhere when everyone was hoping that it was still even going to come out. They priced it very aggressively, so it's great for them. It's all about competition. I mean, I will say I understand the point that they're trying to make, just in that, in this space, right? I mean, it is very competitive, obviously, and that's good, but it's the sheer volume of games that come out, and people are very time poor. Like, that's the issue. That's why, demos are so commonplace nowadays, because developers are actually really trying to bend over to get you to finally play their game. It's a very competitive space, and people are time poor, so they have to be very careful on the games they choose to buy and play. I can empathize with the comment of it really sucks that we spent so much time working on this game. We looked like we had a somewhat clear landing strip, and Team Cherry comes and does this right under our nose, and we weren't really expecting that, right? I can empathize with that a bit, but at the end of the day, that's just what the marketplace can do. And it sucks, but the comment was definitely polarizing to call Team Cherry callous, right? Because at a certain point, there has to be some accountability, and there's just not really a whole lot you can do if your game is not better or more interesting than the other one that came out the same day. Moving on to some PlayStation Productions news, we have an update for the God of War casting thing that we were talking about not too long ago, which is that we didn't really know exactly who was going to be Kratos. Allegedly, a number of names were in the running, or people that are, positioned to possibly get the role for Kratos. Well, now we know that for Christopher Judge, which it seemed like that was not happening, but he has commented on this because over on Twitter, the story was picked up by Covered Geekly and then shared on Twitter, saying that he was in the running for it, and Chris quote retweeted that saying, "I am." So yeah, he's not in talks to be Kratos for the Amazon TV series, but I'll still make the same point here, which is Kratos is a very important character, and I cannot wait to see who is going to fill in that role and how they will handle the character. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where 3 of you could win a code for Henry Halfhead on PlayStation 5. I would love to congratulate these viewers right here. I'll be contacting you all very soon via email or X. Thank you again, Papagenda, for the game giveaway, and we will be going back to a $10 PSN code, so if you would like to win, then follow the link down below or scan the QR code, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about to you all, and our Tuesday video was an update on the AI slot problem on PSN, and also a really weird thing that some studios are doing in order to sell premium avatars on PS5, since you can't buy those on PS5 the normal way, so that's what we get into there. And then we also on Wednesday had the new firmware video, so just showing you how to use the DualSense with multiple devices and also the power saver mode. We talk about that. And then again, as a reminder, on September 27th, I will be at Retro Rehome for their trade night from 7 to 10 in Mount Morris, New York. If you're nearby, come through. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then we also have another Click R3 episode airing probably sometime Wednesday, Thursday. It'll depend on when Sony does their state of play. We might actually hold the Click R3 live stream somewhat soon after that, so we can be very fresh with that news. But obviously we'll play it by ear. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.